Today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Ramani, who is a world-renowned expert on narcissism. She's written many books on the topic and really is widely regarded as one of the leading experts on narcissistic abuse recovery. Dr. Ramani, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I actually started ShareWell because of my own experience with narcissistic abuse. And when I was going through the breakup in my own healing path, your content, your videos, your books helped me a lot. So I'm very personally grateful to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad. I mean, for it to make a difference to one person, and that I know that it means so much to me, and that I hope it's reaching others too. So thank you.
Thank you. So to kick us off, I'm curious, how did you become to be the expert on narcissism?
I don't know if I'd give myself that much credit. I have been studying this for a long time. I originally started as a university professor and a researcher. I really came heavily into my clinical practice. But I think that it was the missing piece of it was lots of people were writing about narcissism and the harms, and the harms to the person who's narcissistic, but almost nobody was addressing this from the point of view of how these personality styles harm people who are in relationships with people who are narcissistic. And in fact, when there would be attempt to have this conversation, there would be pushback on that. So I also recognize that most people will not have access to a therapist who understands this or knows this. So we thought really one thing that could be very useful would be education about this too. And that's how we started on YouTube, is like, how do we get this information to people? Because sometimes people don't even read the books or anything like that. So it's it was a way to get, like I said, this content to as many people as possible. And I think it was, and then more and more working with more and more people clinically, doing more and more research about it for the books and whatnot. And I think here we are at a moment in time where so many people need this help. And again, it was a lot of roads coming here. Like I said, research, clinical practice, consultation, even my own lived experience.
There does seem to be rising attention paid to this topic about narcissism. And in fact, gaslighting was the word of the year for Merriam-Webster. Why do you think that is?
I think that more and more people are being, listen, when I started doing this work 20 years ago, in fact, people said, why are you studying this? Like, nobody cares, right? And around, 2016 plus or minus, the conversation in journalism really shifted, that multiple countries, multiple world leaders, this was showing up there. We see it in even senators, congress people in the United States, more and more people who are public figures. Certainly social media and the internet foster this conversation on narcissism as well. But I do think that as this conversation became more and more public, more and more people were recognizing themselves and saying, yes, this is what happened to me. And many people even said, I would go to therapy and I was told, well, there's always two people who are responsible for things in a relationship. I'm like, nah, this is a pretty asymmetric structure where one person is invalidating the other person and the other person's desperately trying to make the relationship work. That doesn't feel like two people are responsible. And so I think that as world events changed, as technology came on the scene, I think the more tech focused we come, that there's greater likelihoods of, like, again, it's almost like we don't see each other's faces in the same way. But I do think that there are areas of the internet, social media, where narcissism's really been allowed to sort of really fulminate and become a stronger voice than it once was. But in the same token, there's also more and more discourse about narcissism and how people are harmed by it. So I think, though, I really do think politics ended up sort of pulling that first lever, and more people saying, what the heck is happening here? And then media and again, the odd ways the world is so polarized, all of that plays into the conversation about narcissism.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So it sounds like in some ways, I mean, it's a good thing, right? At least there's awareness and people can start to talk and analyze it.
I
What are
think
your
it's a
thoughts there?
mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. I think that in the macro, it's been a good thing, because I think people are getting access to this content who may not have, like I said, access to therapy, and are able to sort of see their situations in a more informed way, even if it doesn't change the decisions they're making about leaving or staying in the relationship, they might be lifting some of that responsibility off of themselves. But the reason I'm saying, like, I'm sort of hedging my bet on this one is there's also a lot of misinformation getting out there, right? About people are using very simplistic formulations about it, saying, "Oh, a person's selfish, they're narcissistic." Where people are using it as sort of they're weaponizing the term, and not knowing a person, knowing one thing about them and saying, "I bet they're narcissistic." Um, there's a tendency to get confused between diagnosis and personality. Narcissism is a personality style. And I think that a lot of people say they have NPD and they have a diagnosis, and then another faction saying you shouldn't say people have a diagnosis if you're not a therapist. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it's a lot of people getting in there. It will be people who were hurt. They were cheated on in a relationship, and they'll show up on social media and say, my partner was a narcissist. And we don't necessarily know that to be true. And yet then when some people are now going through very severe narcissistic relationships, then they're shamed by people on the internet who's saying, don't use that word. How dare you? So it's this very messy conversation that actually results in a lot of shame to people who are experiencing a lot of interpersonal harm in relationships, people weaponizing the term, a lot of people not using the term correctly. So it's messy, as all things on the internet are.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, and I guess if you could help us understand, in your opinion, what is a narcissist?
So a narcissist is a person with a narcissistic personality style. And a
Mhm.
narcissistic personality style is characterized by low empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, envying other people, believing other people envy them. Um, I think I said entitlement. If I did, I'm saying it again. There is a need for dominance, control, and power in a relationship. There's a tremendous self-centeredness, a complete lack of awareness of the needs of anyone outside of themselves. However, in the same breath, I can also say narcissistic people can be very charming, charismatic, confident, compelling, attractive, successful. And that's the tricky bit. So, for all of these really uncomfortable, problematic qualities, like the lack of empathy, the selfishness, the superficiality, all of that is mixed in with the stuff that we often value in society. And at the core of it, narcissistic people are deeply insecure. It's almost like they're built a suit of armor around them, right? And the suit of armor is this entitlement, this grandiosity. I'm more special than anybody else. I deserve to be treated better than anybody else, that kind of thing. And that shame and that insecurity is not something that the narcissistic person's in touch with. It's not like they're saying, hey, I'm really insecure, so I'm going to walk around being grandiose. You might have some sympathy for that, but it's not that. They're not in touch with that. So what happens is even the most small feedback you might give to a narcissistic person, small, it might not even be that critical, but they'll hear it as, people are not in love with me, or I'm not being told I'm perfect. And they will rage against anyone who gives them that kind of feedback. That's what narcissism is. It's on a continuum. At the low end, mild narcissism, people would experience that as an annoyance. These are people who are very attention seeking, selfish. Um, everything's about them. There's a lot of emotional immaturity there. And while in a friend or a colleague, it might be annoying, in a committed relationship, like if you're trying to raise kids with someone like this, or this was your parent, it's not so easy. At the high end, at the severe end, that's where we see more of a malignant narcissism, where we see severe manipulation, exploitation, isolation, coercive behaviors, and it can be downright dangerous. I mean, we might even see aggression and violence in those relationships. And so you can imagine at the far ends of these continua, people are having very different kinds of experiences, and there are also different subtypes of narcissism too. So that's what, going back to this idea of, it's a complicated conversation. A malignant narcissist is different than a vulnerable narcissist, different than a grandiose narcissist. So all of these different subtypes, these different levels of severity, but those core issues of entitlement, selfishness, low empathy, the grandiosity, and that almost that ability to shift between masks, being this sometimes very public facing, charming and charismatic, but behind closed doors, being really cruel and manipulative.
Mm, some of what you're saying really, really hits home. I've had a personal experience that kind of very much mirrors what you just said about
Mhm.
the two-facedness, the multiple
Mhm.
personalities, the charismatic side, and then the abusive side. Um, one question that comes up often when people talk about narcissists or being in a relationship with one is, can they change?
Mhm.
Is that possible?
Not a lot. And the challenge with narcissism, it's what we call a rigid maladaptive personality style. And that's in contrast to more flexible personality styles like agreeableness, right? So can they change? I often tell people whatever change you'll see probably won't be enough to salvage a relationship, meaning that as a therapist working with a narcissistic client, we may see some small shifts in their behavior, little bits of self-awareness, showing up on time, um, even little bits of like saying thank you or not, raging at the therapist, right?
Mm,
So there's two, if we want to look at this, there's almost like two kinds of change, right? There's the change where someone's behavior improves, and there's the change where their toxic behaviors, there are not as many of them. Does that make sense? It's a little bit different, right? The challenge is that if you've been through one of these relationships, you've been harmed. So somebody making these micro changes is not going to be enough. It's not going to make it right. It may not be the accountability, the apology, the awareness. And what we do know is even if a narcissistic person goes to therapy and does the work, when stress or disappointment or something that sort of rattles their ego happens, the narcissistic person will often go right back to their rageful behaviors. It's very, very difficult to address. And usually the person needs access to excellent long-term therapy. And that's something that a lot of people don't have access to. So it's not as simple as I'm going to go see a therapist 4 times. You need to be working with the best of the best, and sometimes for years. So this is a tough question, but the odds, but here's the other point is that if somebody CC doesn't believe they have to change, they're like, I'm not the problem. Why would I need to change? You're the problem. Like, well, I don't, I'm perfect. Like I've got, I'm good. Where would the drive be to change? What are they going to change? I think they're doing great. So they're going to say like, oh, what is it? You want to be, oh, you want me to be on feelingy? Sure. So now the thing you're hoping for in a relationship is being met with contempt. So do you see what I'm saying? So when there's no buy-in, there's very little likelihood of that there's going to be change. The research is not particularly promising.
mm. Oh gosh. Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of members in the ShareWell community would agree with you on that. And unfortunately, and I guess for those of us on the receiving end of a relationship with a narcissist, what do you, I guess two questions. First is there what can you do if you're
Mhm,
stuck in a
mhm,
relationship with one and you
mhm,
can't leave?
mhm.
And then I'll ask you the second one after.
I think that that scenario you put out there, what if you're in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic and can't leave? It's quite common. Many people have narcissistic parents and they would never feel comfortable going out of touch with their family systems. People have narcissistic jobs they can't leave. People are married to narcissistic people and may have minor children or may not have the resources they would need to leave or feel stuck because of culture or religion or any number of reasons. So I think that that's a pretty common scenario. I think it's very important that you understand what it is, right? Because I think what happens is people think, well, this could change. I could be better. I could try harder. Maybe I'm not being clear enough. Like it's this, people kind of get into this sort of vortex where they're taking on all the responsibility. In fact, that's why my book is called It's Not You, because people are like, maybe this is me. I'm like, no, you're going to keep changing yourself and they're not changing at all. So basically at some point it's going to be like you don't exist anymore. So the if people are going to stay, it's important that yes, they understand what it is. Number two, that they radically accept it's not really going to change. But radical acceptance doesn't mean you're signing off on it or saying, okay, I'm just going to put up with it. It's also understanding that you're going to have to engage in a very different way. And after the radical acceptance, people feel tremendous amounts of grief because think about it. Now you're really saying that the narrative you might have had about wanting a really loving long-term marriage may no longer be there, that it's actually going to be very hollowed out, that the hope you'd ever had of a really healthy, loving relationship with your parents isn't a thing. You don't get to have a do-over on childhood, that your career actually took some hits from being in a place working with narcissistic leader or narcissistic colleagues. And that grief will come, and like all grief, it'll pass through you. And then you'll really be doing the work of, if you're going to stay in one of these relationships, it's about disengagement. And disengagement means you no longer bring your best self to this relationship. You have to, in essence, you no longer can expect emotional depth in this relationship. It's often what I say, you're going to keep the trains running on time. You might talk about very superficial topics like the weather or what time something starts tomorrow. You might, you are not going to tell them your good news. You're not going to tell them your bad news. You're not going to share your vulnerabilities, because all of those will either be mocked or minimized or lashed out at. So you really do pull your whole self out of the relationship, and you can engage in a very superficial way and have lots of workarounds. But it's very important also that you cultivate other sources of support. Those may be friends, it may be through therapy, it may be other forms of support groups, it might be healthy colleagues, whatever it may be. But you find other places of support. You cultivate meaningful and purposeful activities. You pull your best self out of this relationship. And it's a hard thing, especially when it's a heavy relationship, like a parent or an adult child or a spouse or a partner. But it is the only way forward, because if you keep throwing yourself into this relationship thinking today's going to be different, today's going to be different, today's going to be different, you could waste decades of todays and tomorrows thinking that it's going to change, it's going to change, it's going to change. It's really not. And I've known people to spend long term in these relationships. And what they find over time is that they adjust to it. They'll say, if it ended, there would be no sadness. If the narcissistic person left, they didn't feel that much grief. If the narcissistic person passed away, they said, a stressor has been removed. I know this is harsh talk, but I'm keeping it very real based on people I've talked to who've said, I couldn't leave. And, I've worked with people where they really can't leave, and it's taking a tremendous toll on them in some cases. But in others, people have said they figured out some of the workarounds. Some people know it's temporary. They have to stay the job another 5 years kind of thing. And they're like, I'm just going to grind through this for retirement benefit or something. So it really depends on the scenario, but it's really about that radical acceptance, realistic expectations, disengaging, fostering other sources of support, and giving yourself permission to really explore that within yourself. That's the staying. If you leave, it's a whole different set of a whole different other set and approach to one of these situations.
Mm. And then for those of us who are able to leave and have to deal with the hurts and the pain of having been in a relationship like that, what do you recommend in terms of healing?
It's funny. People think, oh, leaving's the answer. That's going to be the best thing that could happen, right? And in the long term, probably the folks who leave, they definitely have an advantage for sure. But you got to remember, when you're the one who chooses to leave a narcissistic relationship, it can get real messy real fast.
Mm.
Post-separation abuse is not unusual, and those could be smear campaigns, lots of unfounded gossip and lies being spread, stalking, excessive messaging and emails, people around you being told terrible things about you. Like, it can get really difficult and dark, right? And some people will say the post-separation abuse was actually worse than what was happening in a relationship. And I don't mean that's just happening in an intimate relationship, even in a family. A family can do, like, close ranks and spread terrible rumors and really, like, not tell you someone's died that actually still mattered to you in the family system, and you missed the funeral. Like, it can get to be really heavy, awful stuff that people say, this is terrible. I mean, I think for some people, they're like, oh, this is a wake-up call on how bad this was. I also think that people who leave feel tremendous amounts of pity and guilt. Not all narcissistic people are shiny and grandiose and aren't I great. Some people are actually quite, they're victimized, and it almost feels like they couldn't tie their own shoes unless you stay. So when you leave, they kind of feel, it sort of feels sad, and you feel bad, because most people in narcissistic relationships who get stuck are quite empathic. And so that empathy really gets hit, and you are feeling as though, I'm a bad person for leaving this person who's a bit clueless, and maybe I'm being too harsh, and they did have a difficult childhood. Ultimately, if you stay in it, you are going to continue to be harmed. People who leave, again, like I said, they do have a little bit of an advantage in healing. People can go some people go no contact. They're done. They cut off all contact with a narcissistic person. They do not communicate with them. They do not respond to their messages. And some people will say that was very hard, and some people will say it saved their lives. So there's lots of different ways to approach ongoing contact, staying, leaving. Keep in mind too, some people stay in narcissistic relationships because it's almost mandated. So for example, you get a divorce but you have children you're raising together. So you still have to have regular contact with the narcissistic co-parent. People would say, if I never had to talk to this person again, it would be too soon, but they have to keep having contact. And that can often be a place where there's ongoing abuse. A person in a family who actually really loves a aunt, but to see the aunt, it means tolerating the narcissistic parent, will say, I don't want to lose my aunt, but the aunt's like, no, you can't. I'm only going to be in touch with you. You know how families are. So it gets complicated where people will say, I tried to go no contact, but I couldn't. So it's not a one size fits all. And healing can look different depending on the nature of the relationship, the options, your resources, staying, leaving, it all is very, very, it can all take on very, very different forms.
Mm. Thinking back to, I went no contact after my relationship, and one of the hardest things for me was to rebuild the trust in myself.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
felt like maybe I should identify the signs earlier, and I started really second guessing myself. And that's something that we hear often on ShareWell is, how do I rebuild my trust in myself, my own self-esteem? And yeah, do you have any thoughts
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
that?
It's really not easy because I always tell people, let's just start with understanding it's not easy because
Mm.
your trust is betrayed in so many ways in these narcissistic relationships. In fact, many people say that narcissistic abuse is really a form of betrayal trauma. And so that betrayal trauma at its core not only undercuts our trust in other people, it definitely undercuts our trust in ourselves. I don't know how to trust people anymore. Who can you trust? I don't know how to choose people. It really depends on where the narcissistic person enters your life. Listen, if you walked on ice and fell through to the cold water, you'd be real careful about walking on ice again. And a little bit of mindfulness and taking things slowly is not necessarily a bad thing. The key is that we don't want people to never even go to the pond again, if you will, right? So it's a slow approach and probably much more, again, slowing down, being mindful, checking in with yourself, saying, how do I feel? Do I feel psychologically safe? But some people will say they overcorrect and they really do feel like they cut off from the world. Some people will say, this happened to me again, so maybe there's something wrong with me. I mean, it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's that the way these relationships unfold, they unfold often from a really strong place. We call it love bombing, or at least idealization. Because they start from a strong place, it's very, very easy to get pulled in. And so I think it's just a process of that. And then there are other things you can do in your life. I always say to people, find something you want to learn or that you're good at and do it. Because when you feel competent and when you feel capable at something, it does build up a sense of trust in you. Have routines, create predictability in your life. When you do that, it also gives you some sort of trust in the world and in your day. Have those healthy relationships. Because if you do that, again, those are more places where you feel seen and heard and valued. And so there's these different places you can build up in your life where you do actually start to trust yourself and some of your rhythms. And you may be more tentative, and that might last for a little while, but you will be tentative. You will slowly build up trust with people, and you may even get burned again and recognize you can come back from that. But all I can say is slow and then work on the things that build your trust up and your sense of capacity up in yourself.
I love that. Thank you. Mm. In all your years of being an expert on this topic, is there anything that continues to surprise you?
Couple of things. I think the things that continue to surprise me is how much survivors of these relationships are shamed. Um, you're being unfair to the narcissistic people. They've got their point of view. I'm like, what point of view does someone who's being emotionally abusive have? And if someone's like, well, they were hurt, so they're hurting other people. Okay, so when you go and tell them, please get help, you're hurting me, and they rage at you more, what? So I think that I am struck how in so many corners and areas we continue to shame people who are hurt in these relationships. That's one thing that never ceases to surprise me. I think the other thing that never ceases to surprise me is how much we idolize narcissistic people in our world, how they remain our heroes, and that we tune in, to watch their every word in social media, and they have 700 million gazillion followers on Instagram, and like I said to someone once, we have lots of Netflix and podcasts about true crime and serial killers and all of that. What we don't see is a lot of Netflix shows or podcasts about just nice people who are empathic and warm. And so that wouldn't be very interesting to listen to, would it? And so I think we're gripped and fascinated by it. But I think that we devalue kindness. We view it as like we roll our eyes at it, and we make fun of people who are trying to heal and get better. As long as that's the case, I have to say those things surprise me because it speaks to a larger cruelty in the world, which is not okay.
That's such an interesting point. Yeah, yeah, you're totally right. The news, our TV shows, there's so much focus on those negative actions.
Mhm.
I have so many more questions, but I want to get to the audience questions as well. So I'll just ask one more. Do you have any final message to those of us who have suffered narcissistic abuse?
Not only is healing possible, it's likely, and there's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but you will get there. And I think that this is so much of this conversation is, trying to understand the narcissistic person. And I understand that's an integral part to healing. But the real focus of the healing conversation is on people giving themselves permission to be themselves, to actually give themselves permission to excavate their true selves, to understand who they are, what they're about, what interests them, what, again, we're human beings. We're these gorgeous, flawed creatures. And most of us, I would argue, 75% of us are nice people. And when we encounter nice, good people, like recognize there's a lot of us out there. We may not be may not be the stuff of a Netflix show, but there's good, most of us are kind, right? And and then probably 25% of people are struggling with being nice to everyone for whatever their reasons are. Probably 10% of those people are narcissistic. So that healing is possible, and that we're none of us are perfect. No one is meant to be perfect. That self-forgiveness is crucial. We spend so much time wondering how to forgive the narcissistic folks that we never stop to be kind to ourselves, and to stop blaming yourself. Someone else's abusive behavior is not your responsibility.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramani. It's definitely not an overstatement to say that you are the #1 celebrity on ShareWell and have personally touched so many of our lives. Um, the chat is going crazy with thank yous, and we'll be sure to share all those with
Thank
you.
you.
And for
Thank you
everyone
so
that
much.
tuned in, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, I hope all of you are able to see the light in yourselves. I know it was dimmed by the narcissistic people. It's like a pilot light. It's still in there. Find the switch and turn it up, please. The world needs you. Thank you.